So Chris is based at Swansea University at the moment. He's an urban and economic geographer and political economist. His research focuses on spatial dynamics of markets and commodities in both past and present. In the past, when I was introducing you, I made the mistake of saying you have an interest in Chicago school, but not in Chicago. And you're also writing a book at the moment on the growth of quantitative mathematics in education. So today you're going to talk to us about the concept of waste at universities in the contemporary metricized times. Go ahead.
Thanks, Janja, and thanks, Dee, for inviting me and coordinating all of this. I appreciate it. It's nice to be here. Yes, I am. I'm co-authoring a book that is called metrics.edu. .edu is the kind of the U.S. internet suffix for university, so like AC here. So yes, we're generally interested in the explosion of quantitative measurements, metrics, benchmarks, rankings in higher education. Mainly in the U.S. Most of the people on the project, there's 6 of us, 4 of them are from the University of California system, 1 from Texas, and then myself in the UK. So a lot of what we've worked on relates directly to the U.S., but I'm always bringing the UK into the conversation because I'm based there. And actually, I think a lot of what we're studying is more intense in the UK than it is in the U.S. for a number of reasons, mainly because the UK has a very kind of centralized control system over the higher education sector in a way that's very different from the U.S. But I'll talk a little bit more about that. So, at the kind of near the end of our project, we were lucky enough to spend 3 months together last spring at the University of California, Irvine, the Humanities Research Institute there, where we just kind of worked on the chapters for this book. And near the end, they asked me to kind of write a concluding chapter to the book, and I've been harping on waste this whole time during that 3 months, and I think I finally maybe got through to them, and they asked me to kind of try to capture this argument in a concluding chapter for the book. I don't think it'll be the actual conclusion to the book, but anyway, this talk is a combination of that chapter along with some of my broader research on waste. I've been interested in abundance. I was doing some work on publishing and open access publishing in particular, and I got interested in the abundance of knowledge and information and quantitative numbers that have exploded in higher education and other sectors, and how capital in particular, capitalism in particular, attempts to make sense, and how capitalism tends to be intolerant of abundance, at least for things that it sees as valuable. They have to be scarce for capitalism to make sense of it. So that's the kind of background to this project. So to this talk. So okay, well, waste I think is on the agenda. It is increasingly a point of discussion in all sorts of economic and social, cultural realms. This is maybe the most obvious conception of waste that we have. Is actual physical waste that comes the unusable output from some process of production or consumption. The EU and other international organizations have been very concerned with waste because it's seen as inefficient, and it's also seen as toxic oftentimes. But most importantly, with things like climate change, it's seen as an inefficient use of resources. So, for instance, the EU and lots of other people are talking about the shift from a linear economy to a circular economy. So to incorporate waste back into the production process and make use of it in an efficient way, to shrink residual waste down to seemingly zero, nothing, right? The OECD, similar kinds of arguments in this report here, in their project called Recircle. Even the Pope has talked about waste, and this is, he talks a little bit about waste of food, and that's a moral issue for him. But also, in this quote here, I'm not going to read it, but he's talking about the kind of the culture of waste. So, of course, there's critiques around consumerism and how consumerism itself is wasteful. These arguments get very complicated if you really dig into them, but I'm not going to do that right now. I kind of just remembered this from my time as a young person. Bill Clinton being president of the U.S. and Al Gore the vice president, and I remembered when I was doing this project that they had all of these photo ops where they would they'd kind of pose next to huge reams of paper, and they had this initiative called Reinventing Government, I think is what it was called, and they were going to try to eliminate a lot of waste from government processes. This is a terrible picture here of Al Gore, but he's posing with a stack of paper. We're going to get rid of all this and save, billions and billions of dollars by making government more efficient. A lot of it had to do with cutting regulations or red tape. And there are organizations in the U.S., the Waste Watcher, looking out for government waste. Of course, they have their agenda, and waste is subjective. So one person's waste is another person's, useful government program. In the UK, there's the Taxpayer Alliance that has this bumper book of government waste. I'm not as familiar with this organization, but I'm kind of digging into it a little bit. It seems like, center-right, right-wing, very critical of lots of social programs that are seen, social welfare programs seen as wasteful. Okay, well, why waste as a concept? Well, first of all, and I'll go into a number of iterations of my interest in waste, but it begins really because I think it helps us understand movements towards sustainability in the context of climate change, in the context of a circular economy, push for recycling, for instance. So the other day I came home from work, and it was a Thursday, so the rubbish goes out every other Thursday on the street corner, and our rubbish bags were still there, and there were these big yellow stickers on them that said, more or less, you've not recycled properly, and that the bags were they were still tied. And I was thinking, wait a second. I mean, first of all, we're pretty thorough about separating all of our our waste. Well, anyway, I talked to a couple people, and then I dug around, and it turns out that the city had gone around, and they'd sent people around with the rubbish collectors to shake all of the rubbish sacks, and they were claiming that they could discern if people don't recycle. What had actually happened is that we had broken a bowl, and so there was a bunch of broken glass, with our rubbish. And when you shook it, you could hear glass, right? And so, they decided that we hadn't recycled and left us. So, anyway, the only point of that story is that it is taken very seriously by the EU, and there's a lot of centralized push to eliminate waste. So it helps us understand this. Toxicity is another bit of it. Air quality, plastic in oceans, so again, the toxic refuse left over from a production process. And then austerity as well, though, to just do more with less. So in other words, to make use of every bit of resource that we have available to us. And all of this, I think, kind of translates into efficiency. But under the influence of neoliberal ideas, efficiency is really all about competition, or at least efficiency is derived through encouraging competition. Through competition, people will make more efficient use of their resources. Well, my big question then is, what if efficiency and competition are actually really expensive? What if competition is actually wasteful? And that's the basic argument that I'm going to make to you today, is that I think, at least in the context of metrics and measurements, quantitative measurements, especially those that are competitive metrics, this is an extremely wasteful exercise. So I'm kind of attempting to turn this argument on its head, and you can tell me if you think I'm successful or not. But why waste? Well, I've already talked about some of these things. It positions the university as a public good. So another meaning of waste, or historically anyways, the wastes were unused lands, public lands that became objects of enclosure in the colonies, but also here in Britain. So, a transition from feudalism to capitalism, part of that was enclosing the lands, kicking the serfs off the land, forcing them to go to the cities and work in the factories. Those were considered the wastes. So that helps us understand the university as a public good, as an object of enclosure. It helps us understand capitalism's intolerance of unaccountable abundance, excessiveness, and prodigality. I'll come back to this. And as I said, it potentially flips the argument for inefficiency on its head. So my hypothesis is that the very quantitative measurements that are designed to make universities more efficient, not least by engendering a competitive ethos, are extremely expensive. Okay, so a little bit more. As I said, there's a kind of a number of iterations here. I have three kind of broad ideas about waste that come out of lots of different literatures. The first, I mentioned already, the wastes, the idea that there are commons that should be enclosed. They're inefficient. And this goes back to John Locke, who, at least back to John Locke, who made the argument for improvement of the lands, or improvement of nature. Nature was really valueless until it was improved through enclosure, and specifically through human labor. We did labor on or with nature, turned it into private property that then acquired value. And this was a virtuous thing to do. So, we could go to somebody like David Harvey and his notion of accumulation by dispossession, the argument that still today, across the world, especially in the global south, capital tends to go and find commons and just sort of take them, enclose them, and then extract value from them. And people have made this argument, particular in relation to digital economies and data, that digital platforms capture basically public data, enclose it, and then sell it back to us or sell it back to whoever. Vinay Kidwani is a geographer who has written some really interesting stuff on waste, and he positions waste as capitalist values other. So it's this always existing other to capitalist value. It must be there, or if it wasn't for waste, we really couldn't understand what value itself was. We have to have two sides of this binary coin, basically. He also then spend some time talking about modernity, and you could look to somebody like Zygmunt Bauman would make similar arguments. He has a book called Wasted Lives. I won't go into it, but a similar argument where the rationality, Weberian rationality in modernity is in a way an attempt to order society, and the unordered is wasteful. So knowing then, just making sense of objects becomes an act of enclosure of the wastes. So that's the first. The second is wastefulness. So this is getting towards my argument that the attempt to enclose and the actions of enclosure are actually wasteful in and of themselves. And it gets more towards my hypothesis, so I'm speculating a bit. But that's the basic idea. Attempts to make teaching, knowledge, research commensurable, and this is Espeland and Stevens' argument, to make knowledge or quantitative metrics or numbers is their basic argument, commensurable across departments, disciplines, universities. So to take concrete instances, concrete reality, translate it into a new language of numbers, and then put those numbers in conversation with each other, in relation with each other, in competition with each other, is commensurability. But this, I think, is very expensive. There's a lot of economists and somebody like Ronald Coase, a Chicago schooler. You mentioned the Chicago school. Ronald Coase's argument was basically free markets aren't free. We have to build free markets, and they're expensive. Timothy Mitchell and Donald McKenzie, spent a lot of time digging into the construction of markets, all of the social work, socio-technical work that has to happen to make markets work. And Torsten Veblen is an American institutional economist who was writing around the turn of the century, the 18th to 19th century. I'm sorry, the 19th to 20th century. He wrote a lot about the tendency of capitalism to rely on wasteful consumption. Basically, the upper classes have to demonstrate through their own consumption their capacity to waste. And it's through that wastefulness that they demonstrate that they are, in fact, part of the upper classes. And then finally, there's wasting. This is, kind of drawing on a medical condition, the wasting of tissue, atrophy, death, total consumption. damaging, if not destroying, the beneficially gratuitous, excessive, and profligate university, damaging the capacity of academic teachers and researchers to produce immeasurable benefits. This draws a bit on George Bataille and a colleague of mine, Marcus Stoll, who refers to miserly thinking in an institution that is really designed to exceed itself. So I'm thinking here about, excellent teaching, path-breaking research, things that really cannot be measured, at least effectively or commensurately with quantitative metrics. Okay, well, there's lots of people that criticize universities for being wasteful, and they come from all different directions. Bureaucrats, administrative bloat, people refer to, right? And I'll spend a little time on that. There's people, for instance, management consultants that are hired to find waste in universities and help universities eliminate that waste and make them more efficient. Bain Company has done a bunch of work on this. Bain Company happens to be the company that Mitt Romney was a partner in. This photo on the left here was actually, for me, part of his downfall in 2012 when he ran for president against Barack Obama. He maybe never had a chance, but when this stuff came out, it really hurt him. The diagnosis, this comes from that report, the Financially Sustainable University, basically here is to make universities more like capitalist firms. And a lot of these things have to do with unbundling the university, as you know about, and making the university more efficient. Here's a couple of reports. The kind of infamous Michael Barber report in Avalanche is coming on unbundling. Also, the white paper that pushed the Office for Students, the establishment of the Office for Students. And they don't talk about waste very much, but they're filled with references to efficiencies and inefficiencies. So I'm just trying to make the point that I think this is a strong discourse out there. I was interested in this report. This is more about transparency. This is just from last year. Where do student fees really go? And this is more about information. These are the kind of 10 basic recommendations that this report has. And not number 1, but number 2, 3, 4, all about providing students with more information, providing them with data so that they can make decisions in the marketplace. And then basically suggesting, here, Joe Johnson and Sam, I never know how to say Sam's last name. How do you say that? Jima, thank you. That makes sense, Jima. Basically, the kind of classic neoliberal discipline here. Either do it or the government will make your life really difficult. But you need to provide information so that there are fundamental information asymmetries for students, and so they really can't operate effectively as market actors. So it's all about transparencies. Transparency, students need more information. Why? So they can compete more efficiently in the market. But it turns out that much of that information is flawed or unavailable. Universities have to invent it. They have to create it. They have to make it, right? You could say they go out and mine it, but they have to find it. They have to create categories. They have to make information commensurable, in other words. And it very well could be misleading and could therefore, I think, be a waste in both production and consumption. Could be counterproductive even in students' consumption of information if it in fact is flawed. Okay. So when did we start? Are we going for 20 minutes?
Still have 20 minutes, yeah.
Okay. I'll probably skip a few things. So, a couple of quick examples. Two examples actually that from chapters in this book that we're writing on metrics that we think are flawed or ineffective. The first one is wages by major, which is the U.S. version of employability in the UK. So basically, lots of companies and universities and state agencies are pushing universities to provide data on your return on investment, more or less, and help students to choose what to major in, what degree scheme to sign up for. Okay, fine. I just grabbed this graph kind of randomly. You could choose. There's hundreds of them out there. There's a lot of flaws here, and we have an economist, Zach Bleemer, on our team who wrote this chapter, and he suggests there's at least 3 flaws here. Selectivity, the kind of person who chooses a particular major. I mean, to me, this is the fatal flaw, really, in this one, is that you cannot separate out the kind of person who would tend to be an engineer from people who just sort of choose to be an engineer because they think that their wages will be higher in the future. It's impossible, right? It could be the kind of person who's interested in making more money tend to become engineers. We just don't know this. It's very difficult to find out. There's measurement flaws. The wage data itself is flawed. It's self-selected. It's self-reported oftentimes. It's collected oftentimes in early in the person's career, so we don't have long-term data on wages. And it doesn't include people who are unemployed who may have finished a degree. And then extrapolation. Oftentimes the statistical relationships are irrelevant to a particular person, especially a person on a margin, so a person who might have the tendency to switch majors. Because that's really the question, is which sort of student should make the choice to change majors? Because if there's no possibility of making that choice, then it's irrelevancy, right? So the best, for Zach, the best study done by a group of Norwegian scholars tries to solve for a lot of these flaws, but even then, comes to the conclusion that the most important factor for future wages is the initial preference. So in other words, what your kind of basic preference from the beginning is the best predictor of higher wages in the future. And the implication of that is don't switch majors because at least don't switch majors because you think that it's going to get you more money in the future, because you're going to end up doing something that doesn't actually fit with who you are as a person. And so, the implication is don't switch majors. But, the question I think we have to ask is, are students better off without this flawed information? I think maybe they are. I think at least we have to ask that question. So another one is selectivity. This one is more specific to the US, where they don't have a centralized application system like we do in the UK. So students send applications to specific universities, and every university is different in that process. And if you just Google any university, at least any US university, this will pop right up on the Google search page. They added this actually while we were sitting there in California last spring. The average cost after financial aid, the graduation rate, and the acceptance rate. So in other words, the number of applications that are accepted compared to the number that are submitted. And so this is really easy to game. That's called selectivity, the acceptance rate. So the idea behind it being that universities that accept the least number of applicants are the best, right? And the U.S. News and World Report, which is kind of the most important ranking institution in the United States, uses this as, I believe, 10% of their weighting to decide, which are the highest ranking universities. So Chris Newfield, a professor of English, wrote this chapter, and he's kind of, making the obvious argument that it's a circular measurement, so higher selectivity encourages more people to apply, which means that less people in the ratio are accepted, and so your selectivity keeps going up. And it's really easy to game, and he uses an example of the University of Chicago, who wanted to up its rankings and break into the top 10, and so they basically used marketing firms to double the amount of applications they received. They only accepted the same number of students. Therefore, their selectivity ranking went up drastically, and they broke into the top 10. Publons. I mentioned this earlier. I think I'm gonna skip this. I mean, you could go into research data, publication data, bibliometrics. There are so many different metrics out there. A lot of them are flawed, but I think I'm already kind of running low on time. So, okay. Well, I want to read this conclusion. That'll take me a few minutes, so I want to leave a bit of time for that. So, metric hell is the reality. This is the provost of Florida State University. I won't read it, but basically just suggesting, this is advice to executives, university executives. get used to it. If you're new to the field, you're going to have to deal with all sorts of metrics that are out there. And if you don't use them, you're probably going to end up failing or not performing at the level that you need to. This book came out last year, The Tyranny of Metrics, a really nice overview of metrics, not just in higher education, but in healthcare, medicine. There are things that can be measured. There are things that are worth measuring. But what can be measured is not always what is worth measuring. What gets measured may have no relationship to what we really want to know. The costs of measuring may be greater than the benefits. The things that get measured may draw effort away from the things we really care about. And measurement may provide us with distorted knowledge. Knowledge that seems solid but is actually deceptive. And the book is filled with examples of this. And there's really, actually, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's a really big literature on the flaws and all sorts of different kinds of metrics. And the metric tide, James Wilston report came out here in the UK in 2015. Kind of warning against some of the dangers of metrics, but I would say really maybe slowed the acceleration of the growth of metrics. I don't think it really did much of anything. And really with the Office of Students, I think metrics aren't teaching now are just accelerating in employability. So why is there no meaningful reform away from metrics? Well, it's an open question, but a big part of it is that metrics are injected into or become part of or kind of reassembled or assembled into a very competitive environment. So universities, disciplines, departments, researchers, even students are competing with each other. And the state, especially in the UK, wants it that way and wants that competition to intensify because they think that that will eliminate waste. But I think it's having the opposite effect. The centralization of management and control, so there's a growing class of managers who are really separated from concrete realities, and so they have almost no choice but to rely on representations of what's going on, things they can't actually see, and they have to make comparisons across departments. How do they do it? Increasingly by using quantitative measurements. So there's imperatives to demonstrate superiority in a kind of ordinal fashion or in a ranking way, but with facts. So, I just walked past the School of Environment maybe this morning, and right on their front door, they have three, rankings. They were number 2, number 4, number 5, and I can't remember exactly what the categories were. It was right above their front door in these huge letters. Kind of amazing. Okay, I'm going to move quickly through this stuff. So, there is some evidence of, of lost money. So, I like the picture because it's obviously the race here. The Times Higher Education did something right here for once, choosing this photo. Actually, they do well with their images, don't they? They catch you. So, the cost of unfunded research proposals. That's what this is about. And this is an estimate, but so 31,000 research proposals submitted. 4,300 of them successful, so a success rate of 14%, with a cost of unfunded proposals of 1.34 billion euros. Nothing to sneeze at. The ref is expensive, estimated at least 246 million pounds. That's over 6 years. The cost of quality assurance for higher education institutions, £1 billion. And then I've got a whole bunch of slides basically just demonstrating the growth of non-academic staff in universities. Again, something I think we're all aware of, but I was kind of shocked, actually. And I'm not here to, to bash administrators, but just to point out that, we're talking about 60% in many cases of employees at universities are non-academic staff, and many of them are managers. And my question is, one, what are these people doing? And two, how much does it cost? So my real question is, how much of their time is spent feeding metric systems, organizing information, and populating ranking systems? So yeah, I'm gonna move through these quickly. From 1929 to 1996, money spent on administration for every dollar spent on instruction. It goes from 19 cents per dollar to 48 cents per dollar in 1996. And of course, that's a long time ago now, so I'd be interested in what it is today. This is from the U.S. Growth in different kinds of staff over time. Full-time tenure-track faculty. This is from 1976 to 2011. 23% increase in full-time tenure-track faculty, 369% increase in full-time non-faculty professionals. Very similar stuff here. Okay. What do administrators do? There's a couple iterations of this. Well, Benjamin Ginsberg wrote this book. I mean, this is just kind of a screed against the all administrative university refers to it. They organize meetings. They plan. They polish images. They manage endowments. There are lots of deanlets that have their fiefdoms. And then there's administrative pathologies. So he calls it shirking, squandering, and stealing, deliberate waste of money. I'm more interested then in kind of theorizing this a bit more. So take two, what do administrators do? They collect data from staff and students. And this isn't the only thing they do. And again, I'm interested in, how much of their time is spent doing these things. It really is an empirical question for me that I would like to do research on it and try to understand. They collect data from staff and students, enable machines to do the same. So in other words, they cope with and control information. They enable comparability and competition. In other words, commensurability, Espelon's and Stevens' idea. They manage risk through control and standardization of information. And they attempt to know, but ultimately devalue that which is immeasurable and unknowable. And then take three, to be even more abstract about it. They obey the mandates of the state and higher level managers to categorize and convert data and information to enable and demonstrate competition. Construct and populate quasi-markets in various different realms. And then I'm just referencing Jessup here, who last year has a short piece on academic capitalism. What I like about it is he kind of suggests that there's this development over time of academic capitalism, and it goes through these 5 phases. And he suggests that we're somewhere between the second, third, and fourth phase right now. And so I thought that was interesting because in reading through that, what appeared or what occurred to me is that in every phase, the need for information and data becomes more intense. Financial markets are probably the biggest consumer of data for any sector. They want data on everything. They want to understand the mood of the populace at any given moment. And so they'll take data from anywhere. They demand it. And to the extent that increasingly universities are subject to debt, now the financial industry has a mandate to make sense of, for instance, risk in universities, financial risk. So I've mentioned this a couple times already. My crucial empirical question that I cannot answer yet is how much staff time, academic and non-academic, is spent enabling competition, including the procurement, maintenance, and feeding of metric systems, rankings, and digital platforms. And I'm getting towards a conclusion now. I'm really surprised. I mean, I found this from KPMG, this guy, Tim Cahill. I sent him an email a couple weeks ago, and I'm not surprised he hasn't responded. But I mean, I just asked, do you have anything more on this? Because I think this is exactly the kind of question we should be asking. Is competition driving inefficiencies in universities? I'm really surprised that it's not a more prescient question, a question that more people aren't asking. Now, there are people who have been thinking about this broader problem for a long, long time, and I'll mention some in the next slide. But yeah. So back to waste. Actually, oh, there. Yeah, thought I missed it. The costs of competition. So these are some of the people I think we could look to help us understand this problem. Ronald Coase, I've already mentioned, a University of Chicago economist who wrote really only a few papers in his life, but two very important papers, and came up with the idea of transaction costs. And his basic argument was that we can understand institutions and firms in particular as things that block themselves off from the marketplace. And the implication of his argument is that even inside of firms, there are transaction costs for exchanging goods or contracts. But the other implication is that in the marketplace, there are transaction costs. This really hadn't been theorized prior to this. And in other words, I'd said already that, it kind of sums it up. You can kind of sum up his argument by saying that free markets aren't free. Markets are expensive, or markets have costs affiliated to them. We just don't know how much they cost. The labor effort involved in constructing and framing economies and markets. There's, of course, arguments about the broader costs of failure and socioeconomic crisis, somebody like Karl Polanyi. The costs of demonstrating superiority are what Veblen, I mentioned, calls invidious distinction, so producing these kind of symbolic representations of class structure or social stratification. It's expensive. And for him, for Veblen, it's fundamentally about waste. That's his whole argument. And then Michael Sandel, I think, does a really nice job. He has a book called What Money Can't Buy, I think. The costs of shifting the socio-ethical status of underlying goods. Things like, he talks about, like babies and adoption. Should that be subject to market? Human tissues. And then public goods like education. And he does a really nice job of basically saying one of the reasons that we have to be careful in subjecting everything to market forces is that it transforms the moral substance of these goods. They become something different when we put them into the market, and that helps us understand why we resist the marketization of everything. It's not just a matter of efficient allocation. It's a matter of transforming society. Okay, so back to waste. I'm going to leave that quote up there and read this conclusion, and then I will stop talking. So the OED describes wasting in this context, the context of what I'm talking about here, as, quote, the gradual decay of life or organic tissue, the gradual loss of strength and vitality, or consumption and atrophy. But before heading too far down the path towards the deterioration or decay of the university, I want to first consider it in a brighter light. That is, as an institution that has for much of its history and continues today to exceed itself, or to give more than it asks in return. What could be more excessive than good teaching? Consider the feeling of walking away from a great lecture knowing that you will never think quite the same about an issue or a historical event. This is beneficial excess. Or what about path-breaking research that transforms a scholarly field for a generation? Or ideas that are ahead of their time and will only be appreciated a generation later? We are all familiar with written texts that are so thoughtful and rich, so packed with ideas, that they cannot be reduced to a summary or even a lengthy explanation. They can only be read and read again. This is the prodigality of knowledge, and it reflects what Marx and the Grundrisse called the general intellect. Yes, of course, attempts are made to commodify knowledge, to enclose knowledge, and assign capitalist value to it. And while this value may be accumulated, the attempts to enclose almost always eventually fail. Here we could look to the philosopher Georges Bataille and his notion of the, quote, general economy, where life on Earth should not be understood in terms of scarce resources, but rather unordered, pointless, and fundamentally excessive nature. The sun, for instance, produces more energy than can possibly be captured or put to use by any or all living things. And as such, most of the sun's energy goes to waste. Understanding the general economy for Bataille is a matter of examining things like gratuity, profligacy, and overconsumption, rather than attempting to understand an economy by the wealth it creates, distributes, or makes proper use of. Bataille, not unlike Veblen, thought it was more informative to understand the ways an economy sacrificed or destroyed value, or simply left wealth or resources undefined and unordered. For knowledge, learning, and research, this unordered quality reflects an incommensurability, to use Espeland and Stevens' term. Knowledge that resists comparison, that resists evaluation. But Ty, no doubt, is a radical thinker, but he forces us to ask how and why what Marcus Dole refers to as, quote, miserly thinking tends to dominate contemporary economic debates and discourse. Why is it, for instance, that we tend to imagine resources as scarce and human desires forever unfilled? For Dole, the explanation is the regular imposition of an epistemology of enclosure on the world, one where, quote, miserly thought imposes productivity onto gratuity and value onto the baselessness from which it is drawn. To put this differently, capitalist economies are incapable of tolerating economies of abundance and excess. And so they repeatedly spawn new ideas about how these resources either are or ought to be limited and rationalized. Torsten Veblen is instructive here. One of his lessons from the book The Theory of the Leisure Class, and that's 1899, is that the upper classes will never willingly tolerate pecuniary wealth to be accumulated from that which is given for free. The cultural, symbolic, semiotic, if you will, systems that signal wealth will adjust so that wealth is signaled differently. In our case, through competitive rankings such as the selectivity of a particular university. Furthermore, for neoliberal economists or economics, regardless of whether it is given for free, almost anything that has value, by virtue of that value, will best be distributed through a market. Unfortunately, we see the public university, an institution that many see as inherently, if not deliberately, excessive, increasingly dominated by this sort of miserly thinking. The dominance of an economic logic in management of universities has contributed to an hegemonic way of thinking that teaching and knowledge are scarce resources, subject to competition and enclosure, which must be measured and managed as such. But we know there's always a danger that performance metrics will take on a life of their own. This is simply captured in Goodhart's law, or the tendency for performance measures to become targets, at which point they cease to be good measures. Bibliometrics, or more specifically journal impact factors, are an excellent example. They were not originally designed as performance metrics, but rather tools to assist librarians in managing their subscriptions and inventories. Nevertheless, they have evolved into a way to judge the value of academic research, and now for many are a target that influences how researchers decide where to publish. A friend of mine recently forwarded me a group email she received from her college research director praising publications with high numbers of citations and scolding all recipients to, quote, stop writing articles and chapters that will have low citation rates. True story. The professor directed everyone in the college to explore Elsevier's latest suite of bibliographic assessments, where everyone could, quote, self-reflect on your own future publication strategy, unquote. There are many things to criticize in this sort of management reliant on largely meaningless numerical signs, but most importantly, it explicitly damages the openness and freedom of inquiry in the university. For me, this is the tragedy of true wasting. By attempting to capture, measure, and compete for almost every aspect of higher education and university life, we are slowly but surely causing the decay and deterioration of the gratuitousness of free and open inquiry at a time when society desperately needs it. I do not think things like climate change, socioeconomic inequality, the future of work, or the ethics of artificial intelligence are going to be solved by the efficient and disciplined university, by bottom-line focused students choosing majors or degree schemes based on future wages, or by researchers who are compelled to constantly, quote, reorient their activities to the continually changing imperatives of the treadmill of competition, as Nailing Sum and Bob Jessup say. Sadly, I would suggest that this is the sort of thinking that is blocking real progress on these issues. This is exactly the sort of thinking that prompted Stefano Harney and Fred Moten to argue in their book, The Undercommons, that the only way students can get what they really need from a university is through theft. There are now so many barriers to and distractions from transformative learning in the university that students must steal what they need. The perpetuation of trends like this are doing real and lasting, but completely unnecessary damage to the public university. The first step in fixing them is intervening in the miserly thinking that drives states, funding agencies, universities, and researchers to imagine that research and teaching is first and foremost a scarce resource, subject to a zero-sum game competition, and therefore requiring incessant measurement and ordinal comparison. At a minimum, we need to find ways to subordinate quantitative metrics to contextualized qualitative understanding. Through this, let's work to reinvigorate what Veblen referred to as, quote, the cult of learning that is central to an enlightened society. I am confident that it will not be a waste. So that's more of a manifesto than an analytical conclusion, but that's where I'll stop.
Thank you. That's very interesting. A lot of food for thought. So the floor is now open for questions and discussion. In the meantime, you are free to take more refreshments. Again, just a reminder to people following online, they can... No? Okay. So the floor is yours. Yes.
Hi. Hi.
So I'm thinking, you mentioned Polanyi. One of the things that comes out of Polanyi is is going to create its own opposition, sense of resistance against. So can you talk about that across North America and Europe, because you obviously both? I'm thinking we've got open access journals, we've got gender equality, but all sorts of stuff. But the point is, some of those actually require information.
Yeah.
Yes. Really fix things unless we have some data.
Yes.
By the way, the university is really
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yes, and I can see already in looking back at what I've said that you could get a sense of nostalgia from what I'm suggesting, that the university was once something that we need to recapture, and that is not my intention. I do not want to make that argument. I think we need to move. We don't want to return to a university that is dominated by gender hierarchies, that's racist, that's part of an old boys network. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. I think metrics are similar to markets in many ways. They have the quality of disciplining society, but they can also emancipate society in many ways. And so, yes, metrics can be used for good. I don't want to suggest that all numbers are useless. But I think the problem is that, like I said, they come into an environment, they become part of an environment that is fundamentally about competition. I mean, even Athena Swan, in many ways, it's a qualitative measurement. You know, bronze, silver, gold, not unlike TEF. But achievement of it, at least in my university, and I mean, I'm on the Athena Swan committee, we're working on it, right? But there is, I mean, there's a lot of us and a lot of parts of the individuals working on this that are really serious about the underlying substance and qualities of this change, but there's always a bit of cynicism as well. We just need to do this because we need to have this indicator that says that we're... So, yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answer. The double movement, you know, the way that capitalism kind of produces its own resistance. We need to work on it. We need to work a lot harder on it. We're not resisting enough, I think. And it's a conundrum. You know, as an early career person, I feel, you know, fear sometimes of resisting these things. You know, when emails come around or when my dean says something that I disagree with, I think twice before I just kind of speak up and resist. And that's a whole other problem, both for me and other people. But, yeah, I guess that's my answer.
I'm sort of following on from the last comment, actually. I suppose the way, having sort of worked with data and produced lots of data in different universities in different roles for many years, I sort of worry about almost an overreaction. That I do think, you know, data can be very helpful and informative. It's what we do. It's not so much the data itself. It's what we actually do it and how we use it. And I'm struck also. You know, your book you mentioned is obviously sort of based in the United States. I did some work 3 or 4 years ago comparing the activities of institutional research, IR departments, in a whole collection of American universities. And it was very interesting, how they perceived their role. They were producing lots of data, but there were massive differences between how they saw it. Some of it was this sort of producing it for external use. But a lot of it was being put to very good, positive use within universities, to not just to sort of cut cost or anything, but actually to try and improve the quality of services, the range of activities, and so on. So I think it's important to strike a balance in some of this. I don't disagree with you about a lot of the sort of almost obsession with a lot of things. But at the same time, I do think it's that data and some metrics can be very helpful in understanding different activities within universities. I would also, your little comment just then about nostalgia.
Yeah.
Well, universities were comparing their performance 100 years ago with other universities. There's nothing new in some of this.
Yeah.
What's new in a way is that you can sort of do it all so instantly, and the technology has changed.
Yeah.
But the sort of idea of comparison and competition I don't think is new. It's changed. The nature of it's changed a bit, but it's nothing particularly. I don't think it's actually that new. So I suppose I just think it's important to strike a bit of a balance with some of the sort of things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I agree with you. So there were 6 of us in this team. I'd say I was probably the most critical of these tools, and some of the other people would argue with me and make the same arguments that you're making. And I mean, like I said, I ultimately do agree. I think, though, that the dominant narrative is that these things are useful, and in that dominant narrative, there is not enough thoughtfulness about how they're used. And so I think these arguments need to be made in a very strong and forceful way. And maybe I'm going further than I ought to, but somebody needs to do it, I think. I mean, that strong resistance needs to be voiced. So I don't know if that's a justification for what I'm up to here. But, I mean, the thing with rankings, though, really, what is the use of rankings?
I would completely agree with you.
Okay, yeah. They're the worst.
I don't have the league table culture.
Yeah.
The late David Watson used to say that actually knowing that, I don't know, you as a university received X million pounds for research and another university received Y amount, just that can be helpful.
Yeah.
Where it starts to get a problem is when you start adding sort of apples and pears into a league table, and why do you weight teaching at this and research at that, and other sort of elements within the ranking.
Yeah.
But if you like, the sort of pure statistic, the single statistic that might be part of that, can have a bit more of a value.
Yeah.
So rankings, I totally agree.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say, and you're absolutely right, the competition and kind of the notion that universities are competing with each other. Yeah, I mean, Veblen spent a lot of time writing about this. This is 1899.
Yeah, exactly.
He wrote another book called The Higher Education in America a few years later. It wasn't published until 1918 or 1919, I think. That is a long screed against exactly this kind of behavior. I think the difference, and you kind of alluded to this as well, the difference now is one that the broader competitive environment of the economy and the broader economization of society has intensified. So I think that these effects are they're more intense and they're more pernicious now than they were then. Yeah.
I think you're interesting idea about waste, and I understand. I'm going to the argument in this one way.
Mm.
So the thing about metrics that is their power is that they are corrective and shortcut mechanisms. And in that regard, if you think about waste in terms of time, then they are designed to cut down on waste,
Yeah.
create waste. way of shortchanging, like cutting down on the waste of research to make that decision. And so they have that anti-waste function rather than creating waste. I think that's an interesting item to do. The other thing about time, and I mean the literature, I go from research metrics, so from my perspective, the whole argument that metrics can be used to cut down the amount of time is not something I agree with, but the argument is there, and so you can kind of think about it in that regard. And the other thing that metrics do, and again it's related to waste, and I haven't considered, is that you're saying, yeah, these are metrics we set up for librarians to work out on. Sure, that was like ages ago. That's a very, very traditional way of thinking, it's a very old way of thinking. But the thing about knowledge production, knowledge explosion now, and what metrics does, is that a high proportion of research is not used in scientific ends. We've had a formal place as well.
I'm sorry, say that last bit again.
A large proportion of research published is never cited nor used.
Mm-hmm.
So isn't that a common place?
Yeah.
So you need to consider that kind of well. And in that regard, metrics don't necessarily operate to reduce waste. They also are operationalized to reduce waste in terms of other ways of measuring time and waste of research, etc. So in that regard, they are useful. They don't necessarily generate the waste, but they are useful to identify what waste is. And I think metrics is both fulfilling both roles.
Yeah.
So, if I see like citations on any of my databases, and I see where things are being used and where things aren't being used, then it's clear to me where the waste is and who's not, or what's not. So that's, and then that's a way of making a short-term decision and to go a bit further.
Well, first, I absolutely agree that they're doing both at the same time. I mean, my first question or reaction would be, why do we have to make all these decisions? And I think if you start digging at why do we only have this tiny amount of right. Right.
That's what it does. So I think it has a dual role.
It does have this. It absolutely has a dual role. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. It has a dual role. It's doing both at the same time. And one thing that I didn't spend any time on is that metrics are absolutely productive of a new economy of knowledge production, or they fit very well with, Jessup and Sum's knowledge-based economy. So, I mean, there is a very deliberate attempt by the state and by capital to construct a new economy that commodifies knowledge in very particular ways, that commodifies research, innovation, all of these kinds of things. And in many ways, that's been successful. And metrics fit very well with that whole, kind of way of seeing the world and the actual material operation of capitalism now. And so, yes, metrics are very functional. They're very useful in that sense. You're absolutely right. But
last thing I don't want to do is say, okay, so we'll go back to 30 years ago when basically universities and researchers were paid because their belly buttons all day and not actually producing. So it's far more robust, but well, it's far more
complicated.
And it's a very useful argument. I mean, there is
I
very little people who will go, yes, metrics are good. Very little. We're all going to say metrics are bad, blah, blah, blah. It's an easy argument. I think it's far more complicated. And in my experience, from research evaluation as well as yeah, it's far more complicated.
I totally.
I welcome any shortcuts that I.
Well, I mean, okay, that's where I disagree with you. I welcome any shortcut that's provided to me. I don't know. I try to avoid those shortcuts. I think those shortcuts are the problem. I think that we're taking too many shortcuts, and it's causing a lot of waste. So, I mean, the other thing I would say is just because these metrics are useful, just because they do things, they're functional in the world, does not mean that they're not wasteful. Does not mean that they're good or bad. It just means that they do something in the world. So, I didn't mean to suggest that it's simple or easy, and especially around the concept of waste, it's extremely complicated, and it has lots of different facets. It has lots of different implications. So, but I am trying to turn the argument on its head and suggest that by attempting to make everything easier, we're actually making what we really want much more difficult. Or at least I should just say what I really want. Okay. And then finally, I would just say, well, yeah, I don't have time, you know, right? Yeah, but I also, you know, for instance, I won't sign up to Publons. I was just forced to get an ORCID DOI. You know, it took me. Of course it is, yeah, but it also makes me a number that is now much easier for platforms to absorb and make sense of and sell information about me in a way that they never could before I had one, right? So it's.
I'm going to step in. It seems to me there also is a question about the premise of the basic system, what kind of system we want to have, not just higher education, but general socioeconomic order as such. But we have two more questions pending, so first Richard and Q&A.
Okay, hi, thanks, Chris. One of the things you kind of mentioned, now a third of the way through, more or less, was thinking about how much waste there is, how much time are we spending on stuff which don't contribute to the core activities of the university. So then the question is first of all, how do we conceptualize what core activities are? And of course, that comes down to the purpose of the university, which is the vacancy, right?
Yeah.
And then that's the first question. The second question is, how do we then use or could we misuse what we find out about waste? If all of a sudden you can say, okay, here at the University of Lancaster, we're losing £1 million a year,
Yeah.
or 1 million hours a year doing stuff that doesn't contribute to teaching or research or let's say whatever the core mission of the universities are, then all of a sudden you also open a can of results. We need to open it, but we also need to be careful. We're just talking about the metrics. The metrics are useful, but also they're misused. And they're kind of tail wagging the dog issues for an organization. So how do you conceptualize what is or isn't wasted? And how do you be careful about the use and misuse of what we find out if you do empirically collect?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer your question, Richard. It's a good one. You know, you're asking me what do I think the university is for, and I'm just I feel like I cannot sit here in 30 seconds or even 5 minutes explain to you what I think, because I'm actually not sure I know. So I mean, I'm going to conveniently avoid answering your question. Yeah, I think you. Yeah. I think you actually answered it in many ways. You're absolutely right that if I was to do this project and go out and do surveys or something, or sit with hundreds of administrators and actually try to understand what they do with their time and how they interact with metric systems in various different ways, then I come to some conclusions and provide some data. And yes, it could easily be co-opted by people who disagree with my agenda about the university and use that information to get rid of people who are actually doing really good work, of which there are lots.
Does KPMG or other organizations, they already do that?
Sure they do. Yeah, they do. Well, Bain, yeah, right. So there was I didn't include it here, but there was a kind of a meta report done. So in the United States, there were 21 or so instances of universities hiring private management consultants to do studies on efficiency of the universities, and this organization did a meta report on them, and one of the conclusions was that basically 65% across the field, 65% of costs at universities are labor costs, and 65% of the recommended reductions across these 21 reports 65% of that was to cut labor, or 65% of the cuts were to cut labor. So, I mean, it makes sense, right? It adds up. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So basically, it's not really a question, I'm not really sure, but I really enjoyed the first part of your presentation. That I think it's you really tried to get to the point that conceptual development of waste, and that was very sophisticated at the beginning. That I kind of realized that, and it's like kind of what I learned by hearing you was that circular image of like somebody's waste is not always the other person's value or whatever, like, because higher education is not at the moment so complicated. There are a lot of stakeholders and sectors involved in, so it's kind of really difficult for me to just like, make the conclusion of whether it's wasteful or not, like from whose perspective. Like, so it's all this discussion like really meaningful that we can see different stakeholders we probably do care about, and then like somehow it can be very valuable for a certain part, but also. So I mean that kind of sophisticated theoretical understanding that you have developed, that could have been like really nicely added into your conclusion, your nice monologue at the end. It could be really nice. But what I also hear from you, which I really liked about it, is that probably your perspective of the waste itself is really loaded into, so you don't have the economic value, kind of economic judgment of waste. Your kind of understanding of waste toward the end is more like an academic value that we do care about, the culture that we kind of used to love at this university. So I think if that's something that we think that's very valuable that we have to sustain in this university setting, I think that's what we try to argue. It's not only about like metrics going to be useful or not, but it's more like beyond that. Like what I heard from you is very, very thoughtful. I really think that if we try to stick for a certain value, that we believe that should be it. And that, I think your argument is very solid, that is a lot of waste that we're creating, which is, from that sense, really, really waste. Those kind of my comments that kind of I wanted to make. And then last really small thing is about the metrics. I really like them. I think, in my view, is if we have to have metrics in any sort of, and then we understand that it's a subjective thing, that every single metric is like having a lot of flaws, I do believe that it's better to have more diversity of metrics. So, I mean, even like that, previously when the league table is only solo producer producing it, there's only one way of looking at the ranking of university. However, right now we can think about different possibility, how this university is good in different sense. So I do like, if we have to have it, I'm happy without having ranking system, but if we have to have it, I do like to have so much more producer producing diversity of number. So for students or myself, get a better sense of what that university is standing for. Sorry, I mean, that's it.
That's a lot. Thank you. One thing I would say is we don't have to have them. In many ways, we've agreed to have them, and I think that we should push back. We don't need all of them. Now, I also take your point that actually there is potentially a dilution because there is a proliferation of metrics, and that maybe there's such a diversity now that that no particular metric can be dominant, and therefore all of them have to be taken less seriously on an individual basis. That's a good point. I take that. I mean, my only other reaction, maybe to come back to Richard's question and competition, I would just in general say that to the extent that metrics are used to fuel a competitive environment, they're bad. That's what draws the line for me. When they're used to make sense of the world and to help us accomplish non-competitive, to help us cooperate, for instance, with each other, I think they could be very useful. If they were just there to save time, of course, that's great. But again, my question there would be, why is it that there's such an imperative to save time on things that actually need more time, that we need to be more thoughtful about, that we really need to make qualitative assessments with? So, we struggled a lot in this research group that I'm part of with three notions of metrics. We called it Mark 1, which is just like kind of the worst ranking metrics that's produced and immediately used, imposed upon a university or a department or a college to discipline them. Mark II metrics were kind of the Wilsden metric tide metric system, where yes, we need to pay attention to qualitative assessment along with metrics, but the conclusion that we came to is that basically, unless you make that a mandate, that the quantitative metric always ends up dominating the qualitative assessment. Mark III to us is, it's kind of this X. It's this open. We don't know what it is, but we're trying to come up with an argument to what are good metrics? What are the categories that make up a good metric? And hopefully, by the time we finish the book, we'll have a recommendation on that. But I don't have it yet. And to me, it just has a lot to do with management in the competitive environment. Increasingly centralized control of bureaucracy demands that managers at universities make decisions about things that they cannot understand without metrics. And that in and of itself, to me, is wasteful and a big problem. That's where I come down on it.
I feel I need to add the political nature and political moral formativity of metrics, also in the sense of them taking a life of their own. I think that's really important. So yes, it's useful in the world that we live in, but then again, what kind of world do we want?
Yep.
And what kind of metric whose interest is present in what gets caught up?
No, I haven't read that.
He talks about the metrological is how well this number represents what we want to represent. Sociological is when it conveys like narratives of what its measures. It becomes like a circular argument. They say, oh, I'm excellent. I have been cited 22 times, and 22 times is what's excellent. So it really invades their understanding of their perception of others as well as their assessment of others. That's how they make very
Peter Larson.
Peter Larson is Danish.
Okay.
The original is 2009 version. The evaluation.
Thank you.
Daller, C-A-H-L-E-R, hyphen Larson. And he's done a whole lot of programs from
Sounds really good. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know. Maybe not.
We've reached the end. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you, and thank you for the tough questions. I really appreciate it. It's a good conversation.